Have you ever noticed how everything starts to fall into place the moment you stop caring so much? Sounds absurd, right? Your whole life, you were taught to chase, to fight, to persist. But what if it's actually the opposite? What if attachment is what's holding you back? In relationships, at work, even in your own peace of mind. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, believed in something most people aren't ready to hear. The more you try to control life, the more it slips through your fingers. And today, I'm going to show you why letting go might be the only real path to freedom. Stick with me until the end, because this shift in mindset could change everything for you. The more we cling to how things should be, the more they slip away. Attachment, which in theory should give us security, in practice chains us to expectations that rarely come true. The paradox is clear. When we release control, life starts to breathe. Carl Jung said, "What you chase, runs. What you accept, transforms." We live in a culture that glorifies effort, control, and the constant drive to achieve, as if peace is always one step ahead. But this compulsive need to make everything work might be the very thing keeping anything real from happening. It's not about giving up or being apathetic. It's about a subtler shift, moving out of the mindset of trying to control everything and into a state of self-awareness. Carl Jung, in exploring the deep layers of the human psyche, gave us a key to understanding this shift. For him, detachment wasn't emotional coldness, but a necessary psychic move. The ego must separate from its projections so that something more authentic can emerge. In other words, as long as we're stuck in our projections, people, desires, idealized futures, we can't clearly see what's actually going on inside us. It's natural to want things to work out. But the problem begins when our identity becomes tied to the outcome. When I am the success, the relationship, the recognition, then failure, loss, or someone else's silence feels like an existential threat. That's where anxiety is born, along with fear and the desperate urge to stay in control. Jung said this constant tension is nothing more than the ego trying to hold on to an illusion. Everything changes the moment we stop fighting the flow of life, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. Letting go isn't falling into the void. It's allowing something new to happen, something that doesn't rely solely on our willpower. It's an act of trust in the greater intelligence behind our experiences. When that shift really happens, what once felt confusing starts to make sense. The pieces fall into place effortlessly. Opportunities show up without being chased, and what was once anxiety turns into presence. Letting go, then, isn't about giving up on your dreams or turning your back on the world. It's about no longer forcing things. It's stepping out of the prison of, "this has to happen," and into a space of clear observation. When you stop identifying with what you're chasing, you move closer to who you truly are. And that's when things, quietly, start to go right. But what if the attachment that holds us back isn't about the other person, but about what we projected onto them? Attachment is rarely just about the other. Most of the time, it's about what we've placed on them. We project salvation, validation, or a role they never agreed to play. Jung was clear. What we refuse to see in ourselves, we tend to see in others, either idealized or distorted. And it's in that warped reflection that attachment is born. The ego, in its hunger for control and recognition, tries to possess the external world as if it were part of itself. When we latch onto a person, a status, or a goal, it's often not because that thing has inherent value, but because we've projected something missing in ourselves onto it. The desire to be loved, for example, can show up as emotional dependence. The fear of being insignificant can take the form of an obsession with success. What looks like love or ambition is often just a desperate attempt to fill an inner void. These projections act like distorted lenses. Instead of seeing the other person as they truly are, we see what we want them to be. And that's where frustration is born. Because no one can play a role they never signed up for forever. Attachment is a false sense of symbiosis. If I keep you close, if I please you, if I control you, then I'll be complete. But that sense of completeness is fake and fragile, because it depends on the stability of something outside of us. Jung observed that the psyche, when projecting, is trying to shield itself from unconscious content it's not yet ready to integrate. It's easier to believe someone else is rejecting us than to face our fear of not feeling good enough. It's simpler to blame the world for our emptiness than to admit we may have abandoned parts of ourselves. When we become aware of these projections, something inside starts to shift. We begin to realize that attachment is less about what the other person represents and more about what we've yet to face within ourselves. That's when reality starts to reconfigure. The other person stops being a mirror of our lack and simply becomes the other. Undoing these projections isn't easy, but it's liberating. It marks the beginning of a more honest relationship with ourselves, and by extension, with everything and everyone around us. When we recognize the inflated ego trying to dominate everything, we make space for a more conscious presence, where our bond with the world is no longer about possession, but real connection. But when these projections fail, what's left? The ego panics and tries to control the uncontrollable. There's a deep difference between having direction and trying to control everything. The first comes from inner alignment. The second, from fear disguised as competence. We try to predict, plan, and micromanage every step as if that could guarantee safety. But in truth, excessive control is just the ego trying to avoid the unavoidable, life's uncertainty. Jung said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In that sense, control is an anesthetic. Instead of feeling, we fill our minds with strategies. Instead of facing vulnerability, we hide behind routines, goals, and promises, as if keeping everything under surveillance could spare us from the pain of being human. But control isn't living. It's just surviving in an artificial bubble. In trying to eliminate unpredictability, we also kill spontaneity, which is exactly what brings color, freshness, and truth to experience. Relationships become mechanical. Work turns into a burden. Everyday life feels empty, even when it's packed with tasks. The inflated ego believes it can, and must, handle everything. It insists there's a right way to live, an ideal model to follow. Any deviation from that script triggers guilt, anxiety, and self-criticism. The mind goes into overdrive, like an operating system running too many programs at once. Mental and emotional exhaustion isn't a flaw. It's the logical outcome of this mode of functioning. At its core, control is a defense against surrender. But surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means accepting that there are forces within us, and in life, that won't bend to our personal will. Jung saw the unconscious as a living, autonomous intelligence that plays an active role in shaping reality. When we ignore this dimension, we stay stuck in rational logic, as if everything could be solved in the realm of thought. Letting go of control, then, is an act of trust. It's recognizing there's wisdom in chaos, that the unpredictable can also be a path. This doesn't mean drifting aimlessly. It means making room for life to surprise us, which almost never happens when we're trying to control even the silence. The more we try to force things to go according to plan, the more we lose touch with ourselves. And the more we allow ourselves to listen, observe, and feel without jumping into action, the more we realize life has its own rhythm, and that rhythm knows exactly where it's taking us. What if, instead of controlling, real freedom lies in letting the ego reorganize itself? Letting go isn't pulling away from life. It's coming closer to yourself. It's the moment the ego, tired of trying to manage everything, begins to loosen its grip and turn towards something deeper, the self. In Jungian psychology, the self is the center of the psyche, the totality of the being. It's not the social me or the roles we play. It's who we are when we stop performing. As long as the ego is in charge, life revolves around external expectations. How we should act, how we should look, what others expect of us. Letting go of these ideas marks the beginning of a return, not to the past, but to our essence. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who we are, integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the personality. This path isn't theoretical. It begins in small ruptures. In the moment you stop responding to an old pattern, when you realize you no longer need to uphold a role, when a relationship ends, and instead of rushing to fill the void, you face it. These moments of detachment are portals. They don't promise immediate comfort, but they open space for authenticity. True surrender begins when the ego recognizes its limits, when it understands it no longer needs to pretend it's in control or has all the answers. That's when something quieter begins to stir within. The self doesn't impose, doesn't shout. It leads with a calm clarity. Its guidance doesn't come from logic, but from resonance. What feels aligned? What makes sense even without an immediate explanation? This kind of detachment, far from being passive, is a more refined form of presence. It's acting without obsessing over the outcome, loving without demanding anything in return, creating without needing to prove a point. What drives this state is no longer the hunger for validation, but an inner coherence that doesn't need applause to stay steady. In the process of individuation, The ego doesn't vanish. It takes a new place. Instead of thinking it owns the truth, it starts to serve the self. That inner shift changes everything. Relationships become more genuine. Decisions gain deeper meaning. Life, which once felt like something to conquer, begins to reveal itself as something to be lived. Letting go, in this sense, isn't about loss. It's about integration. It's allowing what needs to go, and giving space for what's ready to emerge, to come through. In that gesture, we stop existing as characters and start living as whole beings. But for the self to rise, another armor needs to fall. The persona, a central concept in Jung's psychology. It represents the social mask we wear to be accepted. It's functional. We need it to navigate society. But when we identify too strongly with that mask, we start living to uphold an image, not a truth. Being the strong one, the spiritual one, the successful one, the perfect child. Each of these labels may sound positive, even virtuous, but they come with a heavy cost. Constant self-monitoring to keep the image intact. It's exhausting, and worse, it distances us from others, because no one can be whole while living under the weight of constantly performing. Jung saw the persona as necessary, but limited. It acts as a bridge between the inner and outer worlds. The problem begins when we forget there's something beyond it. When attachment to image becomes so strong that any threat to that identity triggers fear, defensiveness, irritation. At that point, we're no longer living. We're managing impressions. Freedom begins when we realize we don't have to uphold any fixed narrative, that we can fail, change our minds, contradict ourselves, that we don't need to stay consistent with who we were yesterday, only honest with who we are now. That's where authenticity emerges, even if it ruffles feathers. Letting go of the persona is a radical move, because it takes courage to be seen without the armor, to let yourself be who you are, even if it shatters the carefully crafted image. But it's also deeply liberating, like stepping out of a poorly rehearsed role and finally breathing as the true author of your own voice. Jung summed it up perfectly. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens. Clinging to image is a kind of waking dream, believing we are only what we show. Awakening happens when we turn inward and recognize the complexity the persona can't hold. And in that recognition, real life begins. Behind that mask, however, hides what we fear most, the shadow. Freedom is frightening. Though many claim to want it, few are truly ready to face it with honesty. Because being free means having nowhere left to hide. Not in people, not in roles, not in promises. It means taking full responsibility for yourself, even the parts you don't like to see. And that's exactly where the shadow lives. To Jung, the shadow represents the repressed aspects of the psyche, all the parts we deny, ignore, or deem unacceptable in ourselves. It's not necessarily evil, but simply what didn't fit into the image we built of who we think we should be. And the more we reject that part, the stronger it becomes behind the scenes of our lives. The attached person may say they want freedom, but often they deeply fear what would come with it. The emptiness, the silence, the lack of external validation. That's why they cling. To people, to work, to an idealized future. Not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of facing what rises when everything they've leaned on disappears. This is where detachment becomes painful. Because letting go doesn't just mean releasing what's outside. It means facing what's inside. What's left when the desire is denied. What surfaces when the relationship ends, the plan fails, the image shatters. In that raw space, the shadow appears. And it doesn't come gently. Sometimes it shows up as anger, envy, deep sadness, feelings we'd rather not admit. But courage is required to walk through that tunnel without sugarcoating the experience. Jung said there is no enlightenment without facing the darkness of the soul. It's in that crossing that transformation takes place. When we stop fearing the shadow, it stops ruling us through back doors. We begin to integrate these forgotten parts, the neediness, the fear, the vulnerability, as legitimate aspects of who we are, not to surrender to them, but so they stop controlling us from the shadows. Detachment, then, is no longer just about letting go of someone else. It becomes a reunion with everything we were taught to reject. The shadow isn't what stops us from living. It's what we need to embrace to finally live fully. And only those who walk that inner terrain truthfully can experience the kind of freedom that needs nothing outside themselves. And how does that shadow sneak into the one place we least expect it? In the ties we call love? It's common to confuse love with need. The line between wanting to be with someone and fearing to be without them is thin, but it makes all the difference. Jung said true love only begins when projection ends. As long as we're trapped in what the other person represents, we can't see them clearly. And often we can't see ourselves either. In the early stages of a relationship, idealizations are natural. But when they linger too long, they become a prison disguised as affection. We project onto the other our emotional salvation, our safety, even our sense of identity. And without realizing it, we create dependency. The other stops being a person, they become a role. That's where attachment settles in. Not as affection or intimacy, but as fear dressed up as love. Fear of loss, fear of not being enough, fear of facing the emptiness that might arise in their absence. This fear breeds jealousy, control, anxiety. The other must stay close so I can feel okay. And if they drift away, I fall apart. But love that needs to cling isn't love, it's neediness. And a relationship built on control isn't a bond. It's a mutual insecurity pact. When we release those chains, what's left? Often the truth. We do care about the other, yes, but we've also used them as a shield against parts of ourselves we haven't yet welcomed. Detaching in this context doesn't mean stopping loving. It means starting to love in a cleaner way. It's allowing the other to exist without needing them to hold a fixed place in our emotional scaffolding. It's liking someone without trying to possess them. It's relating to the real person, not the projection we created of them. That takes maturity. It means accepting the other is free, that they can change, that they might leave, and still be worthy of our love. It also calls for internal restructuring. Instead of seeking wholeness in someone else, we find the foundation within ourselves to love without losing ourselves. Non-possessive love isn't distant or cold. On the contrary, it's more present, because it's not fed by anxiety. It's calm, yet deep. It's when the we doesn't erase the I. It's when being together doesn't mean disappearing into the other, but sharing your wholeness. When projection ends, real relationship begins. Not perfect, but possible. A meeting between two consciousnesses that don't cancel each other out or merge into one, but recognize each other. And precisely because of that, allow themselves to love freely. But keeping up the game of appearances and dependencies comes at a cost, paid with our vital energy. There comes a moment when the effort to hold it all together simply collapses. The character created to meet expectations, demands, and standards begins to fall apart. What once felt like strength through control now feels like a burden, and the exhaustion, which once seemed purely physical, reveals its real source. The ego is tired. That exhaustion isn't laziness or weakness. It's a silent scream from the unconscious, a forced pause, as if something within says, I can't keep pretending. And that's exactly when the self begins to surface. Not with euphoria, but with the strange peace that comes when something ends. Jung saw these collapses as calls for truth. When our inner life falls apart, it's often because it's about to be rebuilt on another level. Emotional burnout, so common today, can be understood not just as overstimulation, but as an overload of personas. Too many roles, too many expectations, not enough alignment with what we really feel. Living to sustain an image requires constant energy. You have to measure your words, your emotions, your reactions. You have to always be in control. But when the body starts to break down, when the mind freezes, when the will disappears, something needs to be faced. Who are you without all of this? At that point, detachment shows up as a real option, not as escape, but as release. It's when you understand you no longer need to force anything. You don't need to prove yourself anymore. You can stop, and in stopping, you don't disappear. On the contrary, you begin to appear in a more genuine way. The ego resists this. It fears that without effort, everything will fall apart. But surrender isn't giving up. It's a kind of psychic intelligence. It's the recognition of a limit, and that crossing it forcefully only leads to emptiness. Jung knew that when the psyche is ignored, it creates symptoms. But when heard, it creates a path. The fatigue of the persona is an invitation to breathe outside the character, to ask what truly still makes sense, and to admit that sometimes, before reinventing yourself, you just need to rest, to let go of the weight of performance, and to allow, in that pause, something more authentic to begin to rise. And when the persona collapses, what remains is a pain few talk about, mourning who we never were. Much is said about detachment as liberation, but little is said about the pain it brings. Because letting go is also a kind of death, not physical, but symbolic, and sometimes just as intense. Letting go of an idea, a relationship, a projected future means grieving what never came to be, and that grief is real. Jung saw suffering not as a mistake to be erased, but as an essential process of transformation. There is no rebirth without death, he said. And that applies to both external and internal cycles. When something has to go, a plan that didn't work, a love that didn't stay, an identity that no longer holds, there's a rupture, and every rupture, even the necessary ones, hurts. Detachment in this context isn't a cold, rational decision. It's a deep emotional process that often drags us into silence, uncertainty, and vulnerability. A void opens when what we leaned on disappears, and though that void is fertile, at first, it's terrifying. It's common at that stage to feel conflicting emotions: relief and sadness, freedom and loneliness, courage and fear. All of that is part of psychic mourning, not only for the loss itself, but for the fall of the image we upheld, the idea of how it should have been, the internal script that now won't be played out. The ego suffers with that. It wants answers, meaning, reasons for why things didn't work. But the self moves with a different logic, more circular, less linear. Sometimes, what doesn't happen is exactly what pushes us inward, to reassess values, to rebuild foundations, to stop following a plan that no longer belongs to us, even if it still feels familiar. Honoring that grief is as important as letting it go, because only by moving through pain without denying it can we truly be transformed. It's not about clinging to suffering, but not steamrolling over it. Suffering, when faced with awareness, has its own timing, and it's within that timing that something matures. Detaching, then, also means learning to deal with invisible losses, the ones that leave no physical trace but leave deep marks on the soul. And it's in that subtle scar that, slowly, a new life begins to emerge. Not as a promise, but as a possibility. When what once held us finally lets go, something curious happens. The world doesn't end. On the contrary, it rearranges itself. The silence that once seemed threatening becomes fertile. The emptiness that once brought fear reveals itself as space. And in that space, things begin to sprout. Things that could never grow when everything was too crowded with control, expectations, and noise. It's like opening a window after years of everything being shut. Dust dances in the light. The air shifts. At first it feels strange, a calm kind of discomfort. But slowly the breath returns. And with it, presence. The mind stops chasing and finally begins to listen. To the body, to time, to life's subtle signals. Picture someone who spent years in a relationship with no real connection, but they kept trying, out of fear, out of attachment, out of habit. When that person finally lets go, not just of the other, but of the illusion that it still needed to continue, there's a jolt, silence, emptiness. But then comes space, and in that space, they begin to write again, to cook without pressure, to feel like going out alone, listening to music in the dark, doing things without needing to show anyone. That's creativity returning, not as a task, but as expression. Jung spoke of the psychic energy that returns when we stop feeding the ego's defense mechanisms. All the energy once spent on maintaining a persona, controlling the future, or resisting the present, it becomes available again, and it needs somewhere to go. That's where creation is born. Not just artistic, but existential. To create isn't only to paint or write poetry. It's to reorganize your life with presence. It's to reshape your home, change your path, choose work that respects your rhythm. It's transforming lived suffering into practical wisdom. Creation is when you stop reacting and start choosing consciously. And that only happens when there's space. This space is also where intuition finds its voice. Once muffled by the noise of expectations and anxiety, now it speaks more clearly. You begin to notice connections where you once only saw problems. An idea pops up in the shower. An answer appears effortlessly after days of forcing it. You stop thinking to find and start feeling to perceive. Time changes too. The day no longer feels like a battlefield. You slow down, not from laziness, but from alignment. Decisions become lighter because you're no longer trying to prove anything. And curiously, the things that once felt out of reach start coming to you. Not by magic, but because you stepped out of the way. Think of a blocked artist. Someone who pressures themselves so much to create something brilliant that they can't create anything at all. Until one day, exhausted, they let go. They put the project aside. allow themselves to rest, go for a walk, take an unplanned trip, and there, in the middle of nowhere, a new idea emerges. Spontaneous, alive, pressure-free. That's the power of detachment. When you let go, what's true returns, or finally has space to be born. This state of free creation, of connection with the self, is the opposite of the ego's logic. The ego wants control, guarantees, performance. The self wants expression, truth, alignment. When the ego steps aside, the self takes over, with ease. It doesn't demand, it guides. It shows paths, but doesn't force. It expresses itself through what you enjoy doing, even if no one sees it, even if there's no result. That's when detachment reveals its most beautiful side. It's not just about loss. It's transition, a bridge between what was and what could still be, between who you were when you needed to prove something, and who you are when you only need to be present. It brings you back to yourself, without the excess, without the noise, without the weight that's no longer yours. The space that opens after letting go is not a void to be feared. It's fertile ground waiting for your real presence. In it, life doesn't shout, it whispers. And you, more attentive, cleaner on the inside, begin to listen. In the end, it all comes down to a quiet gesture, opening your hand, letting go of control, of images, of fears, of worn-out stories. Not from exhaustion, though exhaustion is often where it starts, but from clarity. Because there comes a point when holding on costs more than the loss itself. Attachment, no matter how familiar it feels, is not love. It's born from fear, from lack, from the urge to keep alive something that may have already fulfilled its role. Love is letting the other exist, letting the experience unfold, letting life flow, even when it doesn't fit our expectations. Control, in turn, is not a sign of strength. It's just a more sophisticated form of resistance. It's the ego trying to bend reality to its will. But living under that logic means staying in constant tension, at war with the present. And no soul can endure that for long. Jung reminds us that healing doesn't happen when we force change, but when we accept what is. When we stop fighting life and start listening to it. When we stop chasing what should be and look truthfully at what is. Acceptance isn't resignation, it's openness. It's the door through which real transformation enters. So maybe the most important question right now is, what are you still holding on to? What image, story, person, or expectation still takes up space inside you and keeps the new from arriving? What if you let go, could finally breathe? Letting go is a risk, but holding on is too. And often, the risk of staying stuck is greater than the fear of change. Because we're not here to play roles. We're here to live. And real living requires courage. Courage to shed the layers that no longer serve. Courage to move closer to what's essential. Courage to allow yourself to be. Life begins when the illusion of control ends. And it's in that moment, quiet and intimate, that we return to ourselves, not as an ideal, but as a presence. And from there, everything that truly matters finds its way. If this content resonated with you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications to keep receiving reflections like this, about detachment, awareness, self-knowledge, and Jung's deep psychology applied to real life. And if you made it this far, drop a comment below. I release what no longer belongs to me. That way, I'll know you walked with me all the way, and that in some way, this video touched you too. See you in the next one.